The English language is an interesting creation because it actually is, well, how do you say this politely? It's a robber baron language. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, what's interesting about English is that it has an innate ability that when it encounters any terminology, any word that isn't present in the English language, invariably the language will do things like, oh, good word. That's now an English word, and just co-opts it into the vernacular of the vocabulary of the English language. There's many, many examples of this, and some people find these examples contradictory. And if we look at the history of where the English language came from, the English, and at the time they were really known as the Saxons, were invaded by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, of course, had its own language that has, over time, over millennia, become identified as the word, by the word Latin. And yet, much of the language used by the Romans finds itself as important words in the English language, specifically the area of law. Now, I spent quite a few years in my career working as a law office administrator for one of the large legal firms here in Saskatchewan, and I became quite aware of how the world of lawyers involves the use of terms which are based in Latin. And these words are so commonly used that they really are in the common vernacular. And I thought it'd be fun today to spend a little bit of time just examining the influence of the Romans, who had a very strongly developed legal system which they brought into England, which quite frankly took hold and became, in many cases, the law of the land. So let's just take a little bit of time and go through some of these interesting terms that really are an integral part of the English language. Ad hoc. Now you hear this all the time with the formation of ad hoc committees. Now what is this? What it's all about is that it is when you do something on an improvised basis, like you want to form an ad hoc committee. This is where it comes up. And it actually strictly translates to this thing, which really invokes how on an impromptu basis an ad hoc committee can be formed, created. So it's something that's improvised on the spot, and it's used to quite a common extent. Ab origine, from the source. What is the original source of the issue? And so again, here's how a legal perspective comes. And we talk about Aboriginal rights. And this word is not necessarily a word that comes from First Nations. It's a word that comes from the Romans, from the original source. Adrem, to the matter, which is another way of saying get to the point of what you're talking about. So, I find this to be a very interesting term, and one that lawyers like using all the time. Bona fide, something done in good faith, an act that's well intended, genuine, and sincere. So when we talk about something being bona fide, it really is saying that you're taking a leap of faith to believe that what's being espoused is true. A term I really like, in terms of my own personal perspective, is carpe diem. And actually, I find it quite funny because as a marriage commissioner here in Regina, there is actually a limousine service that calls themselves Carpe Diem, and I'm going, how did Latin words get painted on the side of a bus? I find that quite funny. And strictly translated, Carpe Diem means pluck the day, or seize the day, or live for today. Is really the idea of the concept. Set aside your worries. Don't worry about the past. Don't worry about the future. Live in the moment. Carpe Diem. We could all learn from this. Caveat emptor. Now, this is a hugely important legal principle. Let the buyer beware. We're all given intelligence, and it's our responsibility to exercise that intelligence, to take responsibility for our actions. Purchaser is responsible that the goods that they purchase suit their needs. Now, for example, I buy probably more than I should using a tool called eBay. Other people use Amazon. And these are funny organizations where you put your money down, and months and months and months later, from the other side of the world, something that you ordered arrives. And in some cases, you compare it to the picture, and you say to yourself, okay, it sort of looks like the picture, but this is really not what I thought I was buying. But it's caveat emptor. And one of the reasons that I never stop using facilities like eBay is because the prices are invariably compelling, or the features are compelling. And I would say about 75% of the time I'm really quite satisfied with my purchase, but there is a 25%. Do I ask for people to give me refunds? Absolutely not. Because it's caveat emptor. The buyer must be aware of what they're buying. If you're buying, one really funny attribute of this situation was I was in Kamloops, and I put a car that I was driving up for sale. And it was one of the funniest experiences I've ever had, because the auctioneer, gavelled in the day's event, and he says, "Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to start off today by explaining to everyone that every car up for sale today has something wrong with it. They're all bad cars. There's no good cars being sold today. Every car is a piece of junk. So if you buy a car today, you're going to have to repair it. Probably extensively. So don't come to us complaining that there's something wrong with your car. If you buy it, you own it. It's not our problem, because we're telling you today, every car being sold today has something wrong with it. So there we are. Buyer beware. Let's start the bidding." It was the funniest thing I've ever seen. And it was so true. So, he really crystallized in a few words this whole concept. Cognito ergo sum. I like this because I'm an objectivist. I think, therefore I am. It's the rational argument to prove one's existence. I think, therefore I am. A is A. And there it is, straight from the times of the Romans, a recognition that if you think, you must be a person. This is really into the whole line of thinking from Socrates in terms of philosophy. A is A. I think, therefore I must be here, and completely sheds the concepts that come from the Plato school of thought. Circumnum vidia, or CV, we identify resumes with this term, and really it strictly translates to the course of life. Yet somehow it's become synonymous with preparing a resume, which is really an explanation of where you've worked, where you've been educated, where you come from. So I guess it really does explain the course of life. De facto. In fact. The way things really are. So again, I love this term de facto. It's a stated fact. Etc. if you're, an image from Seinfeld, and they use et cetera, a lot in that TV series, which really means on and on and on the rest of the things. And, of course, in current English terms, in terms of slang, we'll use the term yada yada, as it just continues on with all the rest of the items related to this topic. Exofficio. As a parliamentarian, this word comes up all the time. There'll be a board with an ex-officio member, maybe a past chairman of the board. They're from the office, and I love any jobs that have the word ex in front of it. Like ex-officio president or past president. By virtue of the office that you held or you've held in the past, you have knowledge that can be helpful to the organization. You don't necessarily have the opportunity to vote, but you can certainly weigh in, offer your advice, and speak to issues that are being discussed. Exparte, from apart, from one side or one party only. And so, you have a big long document, and there's a part of it, the ex part, you want to focus in on in terms of your discussion. Habeas corpus, an important legal principle. You may have the body as a strict translation, and it has come to be identified as the legal right of a prisoner to have a charge against them specifically identified, that they can't be thrown into prison and languish there year after year after year without even being charged. That you have a human right to habeas corpus. And here is a principle that existed before the time of Christ. I find that very, very interesting, and yet it's still with us today. Ipso facto, it speaks for itself by that very fact. So if you run a 50-mile race, ipso facto, you may be a little tired at the end by virtue of the fact you ran a 50-mile race. Malafide was really talking about something done in bad faith, an act which is done with knowledge that it's not a legal act. Malafide. So if you are charged with being impaired, and they have a blood test that says that you were over a legal limit for whatever substance that was being tested for, and you say, I was not impaired driving, malafide, you were doing something that wasn't according to law. Now here's a funny term which comes up at the funniest times, and I show you an episode that comes from the original Star Trek series, and there was this robot that was found in space, and there's a little bit of adventures that took place with this robot, but it was actually a very dangerous entity to bring into the confines of the Enterprise ship. And what was interesting about this character, because it was strictly logical, it was an operating artificial intelligence and mechanical being, and there were many times that questions were posed to it by Captain Kirk, and the answer was, the writers had come up with that that's non sequitur, and basically the question doesn't follow any logic, and that particular term has really stuck with me. And when I find something where a conclusion is drawn without proper premises, then I find that position to be non sequitur. No one understands when I use these words what these words mean, but they really do apply in all kinds of situations. I could be controversial and talk about some of them, but let's just accept I like using the terms non sequitur. Per capita, we hear this all the time. Counting through the heads, and so when we do analysis of behavior populations, we may say that the number of COVID cases are 3 cases for every 100,000 people. That is a per capita piece of information, and it allows us to manage that information when compared to other organizations or measurements that we are comparing against. Per diem, through the day. Now you hear this term per diem all the time, talking about you're allowed to be reimbursed $30 for meals. It's a per diem, which means it's really an amount that you're allowed to spend per day. So that's where this term per diem comes from. Very common, and actually even recognized in Canadian tax law. Did you know that you can spend up to $60 a day per diem on meals? You don't need receipts. You can claim for it, and you put an expense into your employer. The employer reimburses you. It's tax deductible for the employer and tax-free for the employee if you follow the CRA. There's a website that lays out the per diems, how much you can drive, and the amount that you can be reimbursed per kilometer, and how much you can spend on meals. It's actually defined here in Canada on the CRA website, the per diems. Prima facie, at first sight, evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Sometimes someone is convicted of a murder and we've never found the body. Because there's no body, prima facie, something bad has happened. Pro bono, for the good. And this is a word that's used by many lawyers as to taking on a legal assignment without getting paid for it. You're doing the work pro bono. Quid pro quo, a thing for a thing. So I'll do a favor for you, you do a favor for me. There it is. The Romans did this. Quid pro quo. Resa ipsa laqueur. The thing speaks for itself. A sequence of events that speaks for itself. It's self-evident. The issue is self-evident. All that see the event, the thing speaks for itself. Ultravirus, beyond powers, acting outside your authority. And sometimes people do this. What I call a field management decision. Sometimes no one's around. Someone's got to make a decision. I'll make a decision, and I'll suffer the consequences, whether or not it was a good decision or a bad decision, but at least a decision was made when it needed to be made. So I don't necessarily have the authority to make decisions, but there are times I make decisions. For example, where I work, I've just been issuing instructions. We're locking the door, face masks on when guests come in. No one gave me that authority. I just made those decisions. It's beyond my scope of authority. It's ultravirus. I made sure everyone knew I was doing it, and I usually get pat on the back. Good idea. Glad you did it. So there we are. A whole little review of some legal terms that we can find when we're interacting with lawyers. You can impress them by throwing these terms at so you're saying ipso facto that the divorce is going to be problematic. You can throw that at a lawyer and they'll be surprised when you use it, because it's for them in the legal community very common to use these terminologies, and we hear them in our day-to-day use of the English language. But I always find it very interesting that embedded in our language is a whole bunch of terms, especially in the realm of the law, which affects all of our lives each and every day, which has its roots back to the Roman emperors.